right, so welcome everyone. Good morning to this edition of the Drought Hour. We're pleased to present considerations before turning out cattle to graze. And this is presented by Dr. Ehlert. She's with us here as the State Rangeland Extension Specialist in Rapid City. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Krista for her presentation.
Thanks, Hector. So as Hector mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about options for spring turnout. And in order to kind of get to some management considerations, we're first going to cover why different management scenarios are important. So what we need is a little bit of background knowledge about kind of plant ecology. So we're all familiar with the fact that photosynthesis provides energy in the form of carbs for plant growth and maintenance. And if air temperatures are favorable for photosynthesis, then our limiting factor for photosynthesis to occur is soil moisture. However, if we have limited soil moisture, as is the case for much of South Dakota currently, then we have a situation of drought. So you can see on the left-hand side here, this diagram is showing this plant has open stomata. The stomata you can think of as like little pores on the leaf surface. And those stomata allow for the exchange of CO2 to come in for photosynthesis to occur and for transpiration or the release of water vapor from the plant to also occur. So if those two can occur, then photosynthesis will occur in its natural state. However, under a drought situation where we have limited soil moisture, a water shortage, then you can see this wilted plant, the stomata are going to close. And the reason why they close is to avoid water loss from transpiration, which means that CO2 can't get in, not enough CO2 can get in for photosynthesis, for photosynthesis to occur. Decreased photosynthesis means that we have less energy for growth and maintenance to occur, and growth is going to slow or stop. We also know that plant growth can be reduced or delayed through the removal of green leaf area, which is what typically happens with grazing. But if we overgraze, then we're removing too much green leaf area. And we also know that plant growth can be reduced or delayed when soil moisture limits the amount of carbs that can be produced. And again, that's under a drought scenario. And as you can see in this diagram here, it's really a cycle that is self-fulfilling. So we have reduced soil moisture, we're going to see reduced herbage production, lower energy capture, again, because we have less photosynthesis occurring. That plant's going to wilt, it's going to have lower vigor, it's going to have less root growth, and then it continues over here into the soil realm, where if you have less plant growth, you're going to see less protective plant cover occurring on that landscape, which means that when we do receive any precipitation, we're going to have reduced infiltration, and that will exacerbate the reduced soil moisture situation. So essentially, overgrazing and drought during rapid growth windows are going to reduce next year's growth. And what I mean by rapid growth windows is you can see in this figure on the left, we have cool season grasses in the blue line, and our warm season grasses are that black line. And we have the months from March to November. And when we're looking at growth, you can see that those cool season grasses peak May, June time period, and our warm season grasses are shifted appropriately to the right and peak around that July time period. So we have rapid growth occurring kind of in that May, June time period for our cool season grasses, which means that the precip that we receive immediately prior to and during those rapid growth windows is most critical for that plant to produce. And you can see in this bottom right photo, we have a plant community growth curve of a cool season dominant plant community. We have percent production on the y-axis, and again, the months on the x-axis. And you can see red is cumulative production that by June, again, for a cool season dominant plant community, about 75% of the production has occurred. So that's why it's essential that you consider when you're grazing and when we're getting precip during those rapid growth windows. What that means in terms of management is you should consider your stocking rate. We're all familiar with how grazing is both an art and a science, but there's also math involved, and that comes in with stocking rate considerations. So myself and Dr. Jameson Brennan, he'll also be talking today, we've developed a grazing calculator, and that's where you can find it. If you go to extension.sdstate.edu, and in the upper right-hand corner, search for grazing calculator, you will come to the grazing calculator that way. And what's really great about it is you can input different scenarios for forage production, harvest efficiency, animal class, and weight. And that can really give you different scenarios of what works, what might not work, what you might want to change. The other thing that's important to consider from a management standpoint is having a written grazing lease agreement. And this applies whether we're in a drought or we're not. Having a grazing lease agreement protects the grass. The lease can contain statements about the amount of forage that can be harvested by the animals. It protects the cattle. If there's adequate forage, then their body condition will improve or maintain. And it also protects you, particularly if you're the one leasing your ground. Particularly in a drought scenario, you can include statements in your grazing lease about drought management and destocking or early weaning considerations. And there's a great article on grazing lease agreements by Pete Bauman, one of our field range specialists, that's also available on the website. Another option when it comes to management is to consider early weaning. This was an SDSU study that was conducted at our Cottonwood field station. And what they found was they had early weaned cows and normal weaned cows. Early weaned cows, those calves came off the cows in August, 90 days early, versus normal weaning, which occurred in the November timeframe. What they found was that forage disappearance was lower in early weaned pastures, and that amounted to an additional 1 month or so of grazing saved per animal unit over a 90-day period. And what that means is that that's banked forage then, particularly under a drought scenario. And doing this also reduces the need to cull your cow herd to balance your forage supply. You might also, particularly this year, if you have the resources available, to continue feeding your livestock a few weeks longer. This will allow grasses to shift from, again, depending on those carbohydrate reserves in the root system, to actually using photosynthesis for energy and allowing them enough time to get up to speed. If you have if you have tame pastures, you want to graze those the earliest. So these pastures are going to be those introduced cool season grasses like crested wheatgrass, smooth brome, and Kentucky bluegrass. Those introduced cool season grasses are typically ready 2 or more weeks before our native range in South Dakota, and they are better able to withstand heavy grazing pressure. Another aspect of management is you can improve harvest efficiency with strip or rotational grazing. You're going to have more even animal distribution on the landscape, and your pastures are going to be more evenly grazed, and you're going to have more forage going into those animals. Another aspect with management is to consider grazing readiness. And what I mean by that is looking at the actual plant stage of growth. So you want your introduced pastures to have 3 leaves and be at the 3-leaf stage. They need to accumulate about 500 growing degree days. Whereas our native pastures, you can start grazing those at about the 3.5 to 4-leaf stage. And they need almost 3 times as much accumulation of growing degree days. They need about 1,200. Lastly, you can also flash graze your winter pastures. Again, this was an SDSU study that was conducted. And what they found was that grazing native pastures at 25% utilization in mid-May did not decrease stockpiled winter forage. However, in pastures where you went above 25% utilization, or if grazing was extended into mid-June, then those pastures saw reduced forage. Main takeaways from this are that if you haven't already, you want to really consider being a grass farmer or rancher before being a cattle rancher. I firmly believe that grass is our natural resource that everything rests upon in the ranching world. Make sure that you're avoiding overgrazing during those rapid growth windows. Again, think of those growth curves for our cool season and warm season plant communities. You want to develop alternative stocking rate scenarios. You can use that by using our SDSU grazing calculator. Also have a written grazing lease. It protects the grass, the cattle, and yourself. And again, your management options, you can start thinking about early weaning. You want to start thinking about that now because that's going to affect your timetables for a lot of things, including your marketing. Continue feeding if you have the resources available. Graze your tame pastures the earliest. Remember grazing readiness rules of thumb, and flash graze winter pastures if you have them available. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
I believe you're on mute, Hector.
Oh, thanks, Jamie. Thought I unclicked that. So we have time for one quick question, but I do not see any in the question and answer chat. Please feel free to enter your questions in there during the presentation. But now we'll have Dr. Jameson Brennan, who's an assistant professor and research and extension specialist for livestock grazing, present about reducing risk through adaptive management. Jamie, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Hector. So yeah, when we talk about adaptive management, it's really this decision-making process where you define a problem, you consider what are some of your alternate management scenarios that you could do and what are some of the trade-offs associated with that. And then once you implement your management action, you have this kind of continued process of monitoring that action, evaluating its effectiveness, and then making adjustments as needed. And so these principles can really fit well into drought management plans where you're constantly kind of monitoring the situation on the ground, making management adaptations as you need, and then constantly adjusting to improve things. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about some tools that are available for including in adaptive management plan and range management plans that can help reduce some of the risk associated with drought. These are climate planning tools that can then be incorporated into adaptive stocking rates. And so for climate planning tools, there's really no crystal ball. We know here in South Dakota that we have a lot of variability from year to year in our growing conditions. And so you could have an extremely wet year one year and a very dry year the next. Additionally, within a year, you could have a lot of spatial variability on the landscape. So you might be getting precipitation, but maybe your neighbor 3 miles to the north is just missing storms and is in a local drought. And so if these climate planning tools, although there's no crystal ball, it'll tell you 100% what your conditions are going to be. We do know that forage production is strongly related to that spring precipitation time period. So that March to June precip. And so these tools can really help when you're putting together your grazing management plans to give you an idea of what you might expect in terms of forage production for the year and how you might need to adapt your plans to meet that. So 3 that I'm going to touch on today are the Drought Outlook Map, NRCS Drought Resources, and GrassCast. So our Drought Outlook Map is produced by NOAA Climate Prediction Center, and these are released every single month. This one was released in March 31st for the month of April, and basically this just gives you an idea of the likelihood that your conditions are going to persist or improve over the coming month. And so you can see here for April, much of South Dakota, drought persists conditions for the month of April. Drought remains, but slightly improves in the southern part of the state. And then up here in the northeast corner, we see that drought removal is likely. And so as we come up here at the end of April, they'll release the May outlook, which is a very critical time period for a lot of our grasses. You can get an idea of if our conditions that we have right now are likely to continue, or if they're predicting that we might see some improvement as well. And this can help you when you're making plans for the coming season to get an idea of what you might expect. Next is the NRCS forage production prediction. And so these are released, I believe, on a 2-week basis. And this one is from April 15th. And this gives you an estimate of how much forage production below normal or at normal that you might expect for the coming year. And so a lot of those counties in the east, you can see you're at green. They're predicting you probably have about near 100% forage production in a lot of those areas. As you get up here in the northwest corner, we've had a lot of drought up in that corner, very little moisture that's happened over the past spring. They're predicting you might be about 70 to 80% normal forage production. And so looking at this tool as it's updated regularly, you can work that into your grazing plan to get an idea of what you might expect in terms of forage production on the landscape. Now, another tool that was developed by the USDA out of Fort Collins is GrassCast. And this is a forage production prediction under 3 different scenarios. And so they used about 40-year average annual production to make these maps and predictions at the county level. And so our 3 scenarios are from this date forward, if we get above annual average precipitation, here's what we would expect, above or below normal in terms of forage production. And so all those blue areas, you might have, 15 to 30% increase in forage production if we get above normal precip, so best case scenario. If we get normal precip, you can see here that map, what they might expect. And something to note there in that northwest corner of South Dakota, even if we do get normal precip from this point forward, they're still expecting, maybe 15 or more, reduction in forage production within those areas. So even if we're under a normal scenario. And then this worst case scenario here is if we get below normal precip, what we're going to be predicting within those counties in terms of forage production. And so you see a lot of that red and orange, you're going to have below normal percent forage production. And so if GrassCast, you could actually zoom into the county level. And so zooming in here and just looking at Jackson County, for example, under these 3 different scenarios, you could look and say, above normal, we might have 25% boost in production. If we get normal precip, we'd be at about even, about normal. And then if we're in that below normal category, we might expect a 22% reduced forage production. And so again, how do we know what scenario we should best plan for? NOAA does make kind of these seasonal outlook prediction tools. And you can see for May through July of this year, a lot of western South Dakota is being predicted as below normal precipitation. So likely as we're putting together our grazing plans, we're probably going to be in that below normal scenario for grass production. So we might expect we might have a 22% or more reduction in forage production. And so these tools can be used to calculate adaptive stocking rates. And the purpose of adaptive stocking rates is really to match your forage resource to your animal demand. If you stock your pastures the same every single year, you kind of have the same stocking rate, maybe in wetter years, you're leaving a bit more forage on the ground. In drier years, you could potentially be overgrazing to severely overgrazing your pastures, just depending on how much production you have. And so key to a lot of calculating these stocking rates and adaptive ones is really to have a good idea of what your normal production might be. And so there's a couple different ways that you could get at that. In the ideal scenario, you would go out there every single year and clip a number of different plot frames within your pastures. You could then dry those, weigh them, and get an idea of how much production you had. If you did this year after year and you capture some of the wet years and some of the dry years, then you could average those out and get a pretty good estimate of how much production you'd expect in a normal year. You could use grazing sticks, which are provided by USDA NRCS and SDSU Extension as well. And these are sticks that you could go out there and measure your grass height. And then they have calculations on the side of how to correlate that height measurement to forage production in your pasture. Another tool that's available is the NRCS Web Soil Survey. And so they have a web tool that you could use and go in there and outline your pasture. So this is a pasture from our Cottonwood Field Station. And from that, outlining that pasture, it'll give you those soil types, as well as associated with those soil types, how many pounds per acre of forage you could expect for each of those soil types in your pasture, as well as the number of acres for each soil type. And so for this pasture that we had, it was about 322 acres. If you kind of average out these weighted averages here, you'd get about 2,336 pounds of forage per acre that they're estimating. And now if we're looking at our current scenario, probably below normal precip, we might expect a 22% reduction in forage production. That would put us at about 1,822 pounds per acre that we might expect this year. And as Krista talked about earlier, we had developed this grazing calculator to help kind of make some of these calculations easy for producers when they're calculating their stocking rates. And so by inputting a couple things, this is our pasture 7, 322 acres. Here's our normal forage production scenario. And let's say we want to put 75 lactating cows out there. Under the dry scenario, we could then also add in a record for that, 22% reduction in forage, and hit add record, and it just calculates and populates this table for you. And kind of the two big things that are going to change there is that forage production pounds for the total pasture, as well as those number of herd days within that pasture. And so under this dry scenario, we might have 17 less days that we're able to graze in that pasture because of that reduced forage production that's out there. And so this tool is useful. You could go through all of your pastures and calculate different scenarios if you have a wet year, a normal year, a dry year, to get an idea of how much forage you could have. This will help when you're putting together your grazing plans for the coming year, that you may want to calculate out for all your pastures how much grazing time you have. And you might see that, hey, I might be running out of grass, come September 1st in a lot of my pastures. And it might be a good time to start thinking about those management actions, proactive management plans that you could put in place. Things like, maybe you won't need to purchase additional hay, or see what other additional feed sources you might be able to get, or consider if you want to sell yearlings to free up more grass for your cow herd out there as well. And I think the point of being proactive and going through these different planning scenarios is, if you could identify now that I might be short on grass later, you could purchase hay, or when prices are low before everybody's looking to purchase feed, or potentially sell animals before everybody's kind of dumping animals and the market goes down. And then lastly, another management strategy is to set conservative stocking rates to begin with. So you can set your stocking rates based on your dry year production. And what this will do, give you more forage available in case you do have a drought. And that can reduce your chances of selling animals, as well as you can increase your stocking in good years. And so if you have a lot of forage production, you can increase that stocking rate and capture more of that grass and potentially increase your profitability as well. And with that, there's my contact information, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brennan. And next we'll have Adele Harty, and she is an SDSU Extension Cow Calf Field Specialist located in Rapid City and sometimes works around Phillip, South Dakota. She'll be presenting about grass tetany. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Adele.
Thanks, Hector. My computer was being slow this morning, so apologize for the delay. So when we think about grass tetany, a lot of times we consider this as being an issue in a wet year when we're going to have a lot more of that early spring growth with our cool season grasses like Krista was talking about when we have those peaks. But in all reality, we can have issues with grass tetany every year, and we can even have issues with it in a dry lot situation. So if we have anybody who's still got cow-calf pairs in a dry lot setting, be watching for signs with grass tetany in those cows. So as we talk about grass tetany, what is it? It's a metabolic disorder in beef cattle that's caused by low blood magnesium levels. And if we look even further into the definition of tetany, it's really that continuous spasm of skeletal muscles. So this can be a very devastating disorder in cattle, especially if we get a large number of animals in a herd that are affected by it. And typically it's going to be our older cows that are in early lactation that are more prone to grass tetany because they have a constant drain on their system for magnesium due to that milk production. And typically it's going to be some of our older cows that are higher producing, and so they need higher levels of magnesium on a daily basis to maintain those blood magnesium levels. In addition to that, those older cows are not going to be able to readily mobilize magnesium from their bone stores like some of the younger animals can, which makes them more dependent on that daily intake of magnesium. So when we have these challenges of our cattle being able to utilize magnesium and having a high demand for magnesium, and we compound that with the fact that our lush, rapidly growing spring grasses are typically low in magnesium, that increases our risk of grass tetany. So in the typical spring, when the grass is growing rapidly and that those soil temperatures are still cool, those plants are actually going to take up higher levels of potassium because it's more readily available than the magnesium in the soil, which then results in low magnesium forages. And so one of the things to be aware of is that your signs of grass tetany can also be seen, as I mentioned earlier, in a dry lot situation. If you have these pairs in a dry lot and they go off feed for any period of time because they are reliant on that daily allocation of magnesium in their diet. And if they go off feed for any period of time, you could see challenges with grass tetany. So always be watching for grass tetany no matter the year, because it can be a concern for all situations. And the reason that we are so aware of this is that magnesium is key to nerve impulses and muscle contractions. And so if we have a deficiency in this, we can have some very detrimental effects on the animals. And those of you who have seen or experienced grass tetany in your livestock have seen, probably observed some of these symptoms at times. They're going to be restless, irritable, maybe weak. They're going to be more excitable than normal. Will progress into muscle twitching and trembling, incoordination and stumbling, staggering, and eventually the animal will collapse. Once those animals are down, you're going to see them paddling and thrashing with their head. And a lot of times they'll have their head back toward their back. And if these animals aren't treated immediately, they will become comatose and die. The challenge with grass tetany is that it does progress very rapidly. And so they'll go through this whole series of signs and symptoms in a 4 to 8 hour period. And many times we may find those animals dead in the pasture without seeing any other symptoms. And so being able to monitor those animals and take action quickly is important. So how do we diagnose and treat grass tetany? On the diagnosis side, you can actually take blood samples and get serum magnesium levels. The challenge is because it does progress so rapidly, you would need to take treatment action, and then you could send some samples in to see what level they were at. But if your serum magnesium levels are below 1.1 milligrams per deciliter, that confirms that you have a grass tetany issue. If your levels are at 1.5 or below, supplemental magnesium is actually going to be beneficial for milk production. So you may not be at a true deficiency level that would cause grass tetany, but you're still at a deficiency level that you're going to get a boost in milk production if you do provide supplemental magnesium. In regard to treatments, those cattle are going to require an IV injection of a magnesium solution with veterinary supervision. This is one of those things that these animals can become very aggressive. They don't feel good, they hurt, and you supply the IV solution, and they're actually typically going to have a very rapid turnaround. And so because they are aggressive, you're going to want to make sure that you're prepared for that. But the challenge is because they've been so depleted in magnesium that they can relapse if dietary deficiencies are not corrected. And so some veterinarians may also inject additional magnesium subcutaneously, orally, or rectally to try to overcome any short-term deficiencies, but then you still have to focus on getting the dietary balance corrected. But honestly, prevention is key for grass tetany. And, you know, as Krista was talking earlier with timing of grass growth, especially with those cool season grasses that we have a lot of in South Dakota, if we can delay turnout until that grass is 6 inches tall, it's going to be best. However, as you guys are all probably thinking to yourselves, in a drought year, it may not get to 6 inches tall. And so it's really being able to wait as long as you can and let that grass grow and those soils warm up so that that grass is able to uptake more magnesium and maybe some not as high levels of potassium, because those soils that are high in potassium, which are a lot of them in the state, and low in magnesium are going to present more potential problems in this. And additionally, if there is anyone who fertilizes your pastures, specifically some of the introduced pastures with NPK, that can actually increase the risk of grass tetany as well. We don't see as much of that on the western side of the state, but there may be some of it in different areas. So just consider that in your management practices. And then finally, provide supplemental magnesium to those cows, older lactating cows especially, but your entire herd is going to be important, at least 2 weeks prior to turnout. This is going to allow those females time to kind of build up some of their magnesium stores prior to turnout, and having that heavier draw on those magnesium levels for milk production, and coupled with low forage magnesium levels. In a dry lot setting, ensure that those cattle have consistent feed intake, because if they're going off feed or feed is not delivered in a timely manner, they may not be getting adequate magnesium, and you can still have similar grass tetany issues. So, and this is, I wrote an article for the SDSU Extension website with more details on grass tetany that has more information on prevention and treatment. So with that, as I mentioned, prevention is key. So you want to treat as soon as those symptoms appear, because that's going to give you the best opportunity for those animals to recover rapidly. But then beyond treatment, you need to make sure that any dietary deficiencies are corrected so that those animals are able to overcome those challenges. And don't forget, it's not just in a pasture situation, but any animals in a dry lot situation can also be affected by grass tetany. So with that, I will turn it back over to Hector.
So Adele, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. You do have one question from Carmen. I'm going to read it for you. I'm assuming grass tetany can also affect sheep and horses. I just want to verify, since there are a lot of producers who have sheep.
Yes, Carmen, it does affect sheep. I would actually have to do some checking. I am not 100% sure on the horses side of things. I don't know if there's someone else on here who could talk on the horses, but because of the similarity between cattle and sheep and the way that they utilize the forages as ruminants, it can definitely be an issue with sheep as well.
Thanks, Adele. And feel free to email Adele to follow up with that horse question. Next, we have Robin Salverson, who is an SDSU Extension Cow Calf and Field Specialist located in Lemon, South Dakota, who will be presenting on livestock water quality. And so Robin, it's all yours.
Excellent, thanks Hector. Hi everyone, as Hector said, I'm Robin Salverson. I'm going to be sharing some information on livestock water quality. Unfortunately, it is already a concern here in April already for poor quality water. And we were just set up last fall. Last fall just kind of set us up for that situation along with the winter. We were dry last fall in a lot of South Dakota, a lot of Western South Dakota. And then during the winter, we just had limited snow, which didn't flush out any of our surface waters. And so we've just come into a situation where we've already been seeing poor quality water in our surface water. So, and unfortunately, if these drought conditions, persist, we're gonna only see the water get worse. And that's because we're not getting water into those dugouts and dams and those creeks. And what's happening is these winds that we've been having basically all winter here into the spring is just causing evaporation of that water, concentrating that salt in those dugouts and dams and creeks and all those various surface waters that you have on your place. And so, and unfortunately that poor water quality affects production. A lot of times you will see, for instance, calves coming off of grass in the fall of the year weighing lighter than they should. It does influence reproduction. Have seen that in situations where if they've experienced poor quality water during the breeding season, it either they have more opens and or get bred later in the calving season. And then just overall general productivity of that animal can be affected by poor quality water. And so, also death. Death can happen. It can happen within a day or two of poor quality water consumption. And we'll talk about some of those different situations as we go into this presentation. But I just really encourage you guys to do some monitoring of that surface water on your place. And that will just help you guarantee and maintain a productive livestock program. So how do you actually test for livestock water quality? There's a couple different ways. One of them is you can actually collect that water sample and send it into a lab for a complete analysis. Another way is doing what we call a quick test, or also known as an electroconductivity test. An electroconductivity test. SDSU Extension Service does provide this service to producers in the state. All the regional centers, so you can see Lemon, Rapid, Winter, Pierre, Aberdeen, Mitchell, Watertown, and Sioux Falls, along with Adele at the Cottonwood Research Station. We can all do the electroconductivity test for you. And like I said, it's a quick test. It just takes a minute or two. And all you need to do is bring in a sample into the regional centers and or call a cow-calf field specialist or a range field specialist, and we can work with you to get those tested. Also, some of the county offices in the state do the quick test for us, and you can see the listing right there. So if you live in any of those areas, you're more than welcome to take them into the county office, and whether it's the 4-H advisor and or secretary, will be able to do the test for you. To bring in a sample, all you need to do is actually, as you can see, this particular picture has just a glass jelly jar or a canning jar, and they have brought the water in that type of deal or type of container. You can also bring in a pop bottle or a water bottle for us to be able to do that quick test. So it's all you need to do is be able to go collect it for us and put it in any type of container. It just has to be clean. So we don't want peanut butter still floating around in those jars or jelly or anything like that. I also encourage you to maybe visit with, if you have a nutritionist that helps you and or a veterinarian, your veterinarian may also have the ability to do these quick tests for you. if we do, when we get those results back, whether it's from a county office and or a regional center, a field specialist or a state specialist will actually contact the producer and actually make visit about the interpretation of the water sample, and also make some recommendations about that particular water sample also. But basically, if that electroconductivity meter reads over 3,000, that's when we actually start to get concerned about the quality of the water and having health related issues for those animals that are in that pasture. And probably more specifically, as you can see, we also look at alkalinity and nitrates, but probably more specifically in basically all of Western South Dakota and even portions of Eastern South Dakota, sulfur is a big concern in our surface water. And so we do know that about 60 to 65% of that electroconductivity meter reading, so let's say it's that 3,000 that it shows on the screen, we know that about 1,950 of it is sulfates. Okay, that's some general information we have gathered over the years. And at that 1,900 parts per million for sulfur, we're actually starting to get to a level where we're going to see diarrhea in those animals and start influencing the overall health of that animal. And so that's why we say 3,000 or higher on that meter is starting to be of concern for those animals. We also know that anything above 3,500 parts per million on sulfur is actually starting to cause those animals to show symptoms of polio. So if you've ever seen animals out in your pasture or in a neighbor's pasture or wherever, starting to look like they have blind stagers, they start to kind of circle, or you may see them off on their own. If you don't catch them soon enough, they will actually go down and start kind of doing that flailing thing like Adele talked about with grass tetany, but it's actually polio. And if you have animals that are have the ability to press their head up against like a railroad tie, what they do is actually press up against it to try to relieve pressure off their brain. So polio is a really, unfortunately, has been a common occurrence in Western South Dakota over the past several years. And so I just really encourage you guys to watch for those various symptoms. So basically, again, polio is just the softening and deterioration of the brain tissue. And so that's why it also looks, like I said, they're almost in blind stagers, which if you are able to get them treated, which I encourage you to visit with your veterinarian about treatment, you can reverse polio. But you need to catch them quickly. And again, like I said, visit with your veterinarian to get that treatment plan. If you don't catch polio soon enough, they will die on you, and or you're not able to reverse it very easily. So again, just encourage you to bring in water samples, like I said, to any of the regional centers or those county offices that were on the previous slide. And we can make some recommendations for you. I think personally, water is obviously the most important nutrient to an animal, but it's the one that we rarely are concerned about, but we should be. So another concern that can occur also, and we won't see it probably until a little later into the summer, is blue-green algae. Blue-green algae, you probably don't even know it until you have some dead animals. Unfortunately, it's very quickly, it reacts very quickly in the animal. But what blue-green kind of algae looks like, and it's kind of deceiving because blue-green algae can also be red. So the name of it's a bit deceiving, but you do see, it almost looks like sand in your water that's free floating, and it blows with the wind. That's what blue-green algae looks like and what you would see. It's not that matty algae or moss that you see in the water, but again, it's that free floating. But like I said, normally you don't even realize you have blue-green algae till you have some dead animals. And in most situations, but not all, blue-green algae actually disappears fairly quickly, the toxin, and no longer has an effect on your animals. So But again, something else also to be aware of this coming summer in regards to another water quality issue concern. So just some take-home messages. Again, test your water prior to turnout. I think that's a very good policy to do, whether we're in a year like we are now, where it is drouthy and we already know there's poor quality water, or even on years that are good. My first experience of going and testing water was about 19.5 years ago already. And I went with a gentleman that had his own meter. So that's another option for you guys, is you can actually get your own meter. It's only about $60. And we just went and checked all of his different pastures and checked his water. And he said, I check every pasture before I turn out into them, even if I have well water or not. So I do encourage you guys to do that. It's a really good insurance policy. Here at our extension offices, regional centers, and county offices, we do this service free of charge. So I just encourage you to do that. Or if not, like I said, buy your own meter, or maybe visit with your veterinarian or your nutritionist. They also may have meters on hand. Like I said, contact your veterinarian with any health-related concerns. One of the very first symptoms you'll start seeing with poor quality water is diarrhea in your cows. And so if you're starting to see that, that's obviously not going to kill your cattle, but it will, again, influence their productivity of not just the cow, but also the calves. So if you are seeing those symptoms of polio, again, those blind staggers, then kind of, I wouldn't say walking in circles, but kind of wandering, if you would say, make sure you contact your veterinarian so that you can get a treatment plan for those cows. And then obviously you need to either move those cows into a pasture that has better quality water. Another option is individuals haul in water if they don't have a well and they're only reliant on surface water. People have hauled a lot of water. It's not the most efficient and economical thing to do, but it is an option. I've also seen individuals where they bring in good quality water and dilute out a dam that they may have there. And then I'm seeing a lot more individuals running pipeline across above ground and just being a temporary water source for animals. So that's another option. We did do some research. A lot of people, the very first question is what can we do so that we can utilize those pastures and still stay in there even though it's poor quality water. We did do some research here at SDSU down at the Cottonwood Research Station, actually several years ago. And we were feeding dietary thiamine because that is one thing that we use for a treatment plan when an animal gets polio is thiamine. And so what we were doing was feeding it a dietary level of thiamine, and unfortunately it was not sufficient and enough to prevent polio. So disappointing, but unfortunately dietary thiamine is not sufficient to prevent polio. Another one is just because your neighbor is not seeing issues does not mean you won't. I get this a lot from producers, is like, well, this creek runs through my neighbors and through mine, and it goes on. And he goes, my neighbor's cows have been out there since May, and they're seeing no issues. And it's now July. And I'm like, well, I said, that's not necessarily true, because cattle will acclimate to poor quality water. So if that neighbor had been out there since mid-May, they'd been able to acclimate to that poor quality water. So obviously, hopefully in mid-May, it's a little better quality. And as the summer progresses, the water quality gets poorer. But those animals are able to acclimate to that. However, if you are coming off of, so the neighbor is not seeing any issues, but you could see issues because maybe they just came off of well water and that TDS was only 1,000. And then you put them on this crick that was 4,000. You could definitely see some issues, concerns, health-related issues, like I said, diarrhea, poor productivity, and maybe even polio. So just because your neighbors are not seeing issues doesn't mean you won't see issues. And like I said, cattle will acclimate to the poor quality water But you will also see those animals coming off in the fall of the year lighter, especially your weaning weights. So again, just because your neighbor is not seeing it doesn't mean you won't, kind of thing. Also, even within a pasture, one dugout might be good and the other one may not be. So again, just testing all the various water sources is really critical. If your cows are trying to go back to where they came from, it's a good sign your water is bad. So I see this also. People are like, yeah, my cows went right through that gate and back to their original pasture that they were in. And I'm like, well, that's probably because your water is bad. And they knew where they were before it was good. So if your animals are trying to get through the gates or through the fences and just trying to get back to where they were, a very good indication your water is bad. The clearer the water, typically the poorer the quality. So people bring in samples, or I go out somewhere and start and I do some sampling, and they're like, oh, this is a nice clear dugout or a nice clear dam. It's going to be good. And then I bet them and say it's going to be bad, and it usually is. Because if it's nice and clear, that means frogs and fish and bugs can't live in it because of the total salts that are in there. So typically the murkier the water is probably better than the clearer the water. If the water is clear, again, the salts are probably so high that all those living organisms can't live in there. Okay. Secondly, also spring-fed water sources are not always good. Another common misnomer or myth, people come in and say, well, it came from a spring, so it should be okay. But I've seen over the years that springs are not always good, meaning there's always that constant water coming in from that soil profile, coming into that dam, for instance. But then there's that constant evaporation. So if it stays hot, dry, and windy, we get that constant evaporation of that water, but that salt is still coming into that water or into that surface, into that dam. So again, I encourage you, even though it's spring fed, to also have those various water sources tested. And then lastly, test your water even on wet years or even just average years. I've come into a lot of different situations where someone loses cows in a pasture all the time, whether it's a wet year, an average year, or a dry year. And it turns out that water source is always poor. Okay, so there is that, we always think, test your water when it's dry, test your water when it's dry. But in reality, like I said, a good policy is to test before turnout into each of those pastures, whether it's a dry year, a wet year, or an average year. And with that, I'm done. So any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And next is just my contact information. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Robin, for that excellent presentation. And I do not see any questions in the Q&A or the chat. However, please feel free. Oh, here's one popping up. And while we're taking those questions, Connie is going to show the code, the QR code. And so we'll do that simultaneously. Here's an anonymous attendee. I assume that the test results with a meter is instant. And so Adele, that's all you.
That's me actually, but yes.
Oh, sorry, Robin.
That's
Yep. Okay.
That's all right. Yes, it's instant. So it takes less than probably 30 seconds, depending on the temperature of the water that you bring into us. So it is basically instant. Like I said, we can go out into the field and do it. So I take my handy dandy little scooper and I can scoop, and right there at that dam, I can tell that individual what that water quality is. Like I said, it's just a really good indication of where you're at. And if it's low, then you're good to go. If you fall in that 3,000 to that kind of 6,000, it's a concern, and we may send it in for further testing. But if it's much higher than that, we know it's just very poor quality water, and you have to make sure there's another water source for that animal. So yep, it's instant.
Are there any other questions? Let's see, here's one. Is the concern of delay between water sample collection and testing?
Is there a concern and delay? And sorry,
Yeah, so let me read that one again. So I think is there a concern and delay between the, like, actually getting the sample from how I'm reading this to testing it?
sorry. No, actually, it's not too much of a concern. So if you tested it the day before and brought it in to me today, that is not an issue or a concern, especially when we're doing livestock water. And remember, this is only for livestock water. If it's human consumption, that is a whole different story, and we won't go into that. But no, there isn't. I've had people bring it in to me where it's sat in the pickup for a couple days, so it's not a huge concern. The only thing is I don't recommend putting it up in the dash or something like that and have sun beating down on it. But you can bring it in a day or two later, and it's not an issue. So.
Oh, sorry. They're just saying thank you, Robin. Any other questions?
I was just going to say real quick, I'll be taking down that QR code in a moment. So this will be the only opportunity to get that QR code if you need it for CCA credits.
Okay, and why don't we do that and wait for that? Or I guess it's down now. We will go ahead and end the drought hour, but thank you to all our presenters, and please feel free to follow up with them via email, and their emails are on the SDSU Extension webpage. Okay, great. So after we complete that poll, we'll end the webinar. So this concludes the livestock edition of the Drought Hour. Thank you all for attending, and take care.